The night of the disappearances.
It was supposed to be just another quiet overnight shift at the Amazon fulfillment center in a small, isolated town. The graveyard crew, a skeleton team of 5 workers, had grown used to the cold silence of the warehouse once the day shift left. But that night was different. That night, something was wrong. Carl, the shift supervisor, always had a habit of arriving early and doing rounds before anyone else. The warehouse was massive, a maze of towering shelves and never-ending rows of boxes. But that evening, as he passed through Section 34C, he heard something, a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping on metal. He paused, glancing down the shadowy aisle. The tapping stopped. He assumed it was just a malfunctioning piece of equipment and made a mental note to check it later. But as he turned to leave, there it was again. Thump, thump, thump. Louder this time. It seemed to be coming from one of the storage containers. But that was impossible. No one was back here. Carl walked cautiously down the aisle, following the sound. It grew louder, more insistent, like someone banging to get out. When he reached the source, it was a storage unit that hadn't been touched in months. Hesitating, he reached for the lock. But as soon as his fingers brushed the metal, the banging stopped, leaving only eerie silence. Carl stood frozen for a moment, hand hovering over the container, heart pounding in his chest. Then, from behind him, he heard a whisper, his name barely audible but unmistakable. Spinning around, he saw nothing but the dimly lit aisle stretching endlessly in both directions. He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, chalking it up to his nerves. But as he walked away, the banging resumed, faster and more desperate. He didn't look back. By the time the rest of the night crew arrived, Carl had already pushed the experience to the back of his mind. They started the shift as usual. No one mentioned anything strange, but there was a strange tension in the air, like everyone could feel that something was off. Around 1 a.m., Carl noticed that one of the workers, Jenny, was missing. She had been assigned to Section 34C, the same section where he had heard the noises earlier. He radioed her, but there was no response. Assuming she might be on break, he didn't think much of it. But as time passed, and Jenny didn't return, concern set in. Carl grabbed his flashlight and went to check on her. As he walked down the same dim aisle from earlier, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. There was no sound, no movement, just the cold, still air. And then he found it. Jenny's handheld scanner lying abandoned on the floor. No sign of Jenny. A cold chill ran down his spine. He picked up the scanner, his mind racing. He called for the rest of the crew, telling them to stop their work and help search for Jenny. They spread out, combing the warehouse section by section, calling her name. As the search dragged on, they realized something terrifying. Jenny wasn't the only one missing. Paul, another worker, hadn't checked in for over an hour. Then Linda, one of the newer employees, disappeared as well. Carl's anxiety turned to panic. He gathered the remaining 2 workers, Chris and Tom, and they made their way to the security room. The warehouse's vast network of cameras would help them find their missing co-workers, or so they hoped. When they reached the security office, Carl's heart sank. The monitor showed footage from only minutes earlier. Jenny, Paul, and Linda were all visible, standing in different parts of the warehouse. But something was horribly wrong. They were just standing there, motionless, staring into the cameras with vacant expressions. There was something wrong with their eyes. They were wide open, unblinking, almost as if they weren't seeing anything at all. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered, backing away from the screen. "Are they playing a prank?" Before Carl could answer, the footage flickered. Static filled the screen, and when it cleared, the monitor showed something else, something far worse. The workers were no longer standing still. They were walking slowly but deliberately toward the heart of the warehouse, toward Section 34C. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. Carl tried to radio them, but there was no response. Desperate, he shouted into the radio, demanding they come back, but all he heard was silence, followed by the same whisper from earlier, his name echoing through the speakers. "Carl!" Chris grabbed his arm, fear evident in his eyes. "We have to get out of here." Carl wasn't thinking straight. All he knew was that something had taken his crew, and he had to stop it. grabbing a flashlight. He headed towards section 34C, Chris and Tom following reluctantly behind him. As they approached the aisle, the air grew colder, thick with tension. And then they saw it, Jenny, Paul, and Linda, standing side by side in front of the same storage container Carl had heard the banging from earlier. Their backs were to him, their heads tilted at odd angles. "Jenny?" Carl called out, his voice trembling. There was no response. Slowly, he moved closer, but something told him to stop. And then in unison, they all turned. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow and lifeless, their skin stretched tightly over their bones. They opened their mouths, but no sound came out. Instead, Carl heard the whisper again, louder this time, echoing through the warehouse. "Carl. Carl." Suddenly, Jenny took a step forward, and the others followed. They moved toward Carl, their eyes locked on him. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. Chris and Tom bolted, disappearing into the shadows, but Carl couldn't move. He was frozen in place, watching as his former co-workers, or whatever was left of them, drew closer. And then, from behind him, the storage container creaked open, its rusty hinges groaning like a dying animal. Carl turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Inside the container was nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to pull at him, drawing him in. The whisper was louder now, relentless, surrounding him. "Carl, join us." As the darkness reached out, wrapping itself around him, Carl's scream echoed through the empty aisles of the warehouse. And then there was silence. By morning, the warehouse was empty. The night crew had vanished without a trace. All that remained were the security tapes, showing Carl, Chris, and Tom walking into the dark, just like the others, their faces blank and their eyes void of life.